Welcome back, everybody. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Tom Kraus, Vice President of Government Relations at the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. All yours, Tom.
Well, thank you so much for having me to join you to talk about drug shortages today. I'm Tom Kraus. I lead the government relations team at ASHP. My background is kind of a mix of time in the pharmacy world and the Food and Drug Administration. I was the associate commissioner at the Food and Drug Administration, focusing on kind of a range of issues, including drug shortages, as well as the chief of staff there. And so I'm excited to share some of this content with you. For folks who are not familiar with ASHP's role in drug shortages, ASHP works closely with the University of Utah to track drug shortages nationally. And that is, and will often share information both with the public, ASHP members, manufacturers, the Food and Drug Administration, and Congress about drug shortages that we are seeing in real time. And we work closely with the FDA and members of Congress to try to develop policies to respond to drug shortages. So I want to share my screen and we can talk about some of what ASHP is seeing in the sort of ongoing landscape of drug shortages. And then we'll get into some of the proposed responses to drug shortages and how we can mitigate them going forward. One of the things that is top of mind for a lot of folks, if you've turned on the news the last couple of days, is tariffs. I promise we will get to tariffs toward the end of the conversation and just kind of talk through what might be the implications, pro and con of tariffs as a response to some of the concentration of manufacturing of some finished dosage forms, APIs, key starting materials in other countries and where we lack some domestic manufacturing capacity. I think the punchline will be tariffs are not going to be the primary solution to that issue, and we should talk about how they could have some short-term implications for shortages, but we'll get to that later. I just know that it's top of mind, so I want to just flag it from the outset. Okay, so our learning objectives for today's conversation. I'm going to talk us through what we are seeing as far as the frequency and persistence of drug shortages, give you a sense of where those shortages tend to be concentrated, and some of the impacts of those shortages on both health system budgets as well as patient care. I want to summarize some of the policy proposals that are out there, both in Congress and elsewhere, to mitigate shortages and their impacts on patient care. And I want to propose some potential solutions for your consideration. These are the kinds of things that we discuss regularly with policymakers, and I know some of them are in the works. And then I want to we'll share some information about what practical strategies pharmacists can implement to manage drug shortages, and you'll see some approaches that are clinical in nature and some that are operational in nature. All right, so let's just get into the numbers of drug shortages. As you're probably aware, drug shortages have been persistently high, hovering around 300 active shortages for several years now. We are just slightly off that all-time high, but I wouldn't, it's nothing to write home about. We're still at, nearly 300 ongoing shortages. But they also tend to be quite long-lasting. You'll see of the shortages that are ongoing today, almost 50% of them started 3 years ago and have persisted. So I want folks to understand, some key takeaways. Shortages are near all-time highs. They last a long time, and that gets to some of the economic drivers of shortages. This isn't a blip, right? This isn't, you'll hear a lot of, a year ago, we heard a lot of kind of attention around shortages of GLP-1s. And I think that caught policymakers' attention, but that's not that sort of demand spike that supply can catch up to. That's not the kind of the main version of shortages that we see out in the market. And so I want to make sure we just distinguish those. Natural disasters have also kind of repeatedly played into drug shortages. You've seen that a couple times with Hurricane Helene. We saw a tornado hitting a manufacturing plant. A few months before that, we saw, several years ago, we saw hurricanes hitting manufacturing sites in Puerto Rico. And so one of our messages from ASHP is, concentration of manufacturing supply is also a risk. There's a lot of conversation about onshoring of manufacturing. That can be a good thing, but if that domestic manufacturing is concentrated at one site and that site gets hit by a tornado, you didn't solve anything, right? You've actually probably made the problem worse because you have no diversity in your supply chain to turn to. So we just want to make sure we keep those things in mind. And then that last bullet, workload required to manage shortage, is significant, and I will talk about some of the pain that shortages cause on the staffing front and just workload to the pharmacy workforce in health systems. So what do those shortages look like year to year? I already mentioned that we are near all-time highs. This is a graph of the new shortages. So remember, I mentioned that there are something like nearly 300 persistent shortages. So while the number of new shortages has gone down, you still see these persistent shortages and the total number of active shortages kind of near all-time highs. I also want to just make sure that folks take away that a lot of, we see a sort of injectable and non-injectable markets being affected. I think for policymakers, maybe not for pharmacists and practicing clinicians, but for policymakers, the injectable market is somewhat invisible, right? It's not the market that they think of and that kind of gets reported about in the news nearly as much. If there are, if children's Tylenol has a shortage, like that is something that parents are writing in about, and that is highly visible. But I want to make sure that folks understand that something like half the shortages that we see at any given time are in the injectable market. It's usually generic sterile injectables, and there are some unique economic challenges with those products. Obviously, those are products that have very tight manufacturing controls on them. It's quite expensive to manufacture some of those and to establish manufacturing facilities for those, but the margins on them are very, very slim. As a result, it's not terribly profitable. And we'll get into some of the economic reasons, but it should be kind of straightforward to understand that if it's a particularly complex and expensive drug to manufacture and it's not very profitable, you've got a lot of missing sort of economic incentives for manufacturers to enter that space. And so that story is going to come through as we look at some of the drivers and some of the solutions we need to consider to respond to shortages. This graph just gives you a sense of the kind of ongoing trend quarter by quarter of shortages. As I mentioned, we are just slightly off that peak of 323 active shortages, but it's really just it's just sort of variation around this 300 active shortages numbers. Obviously there was an uptick around COVID that certainly did drive some shortages. Some of those were manufacturing challenges. Some of those were, to a lesser extent, geopolitical issues. And there were actually some demand spikes in that period. I mentioned that demand spikes are not the main driver of shortages, but they are occasionally drivers of shortages. So when you saw lots of patients requiring mechanical ventilation, there were quite a few medications that were being used at several 100% of their normal their normal use for a facility, just based on the numbers of patients that were being ventilated, and that did create a significant year spike in utilization. And so it is. I don't want to give folks the sense that it's impossible to have demand induced shortages. They do happen, but it's not the sort of pervasive driver. So just keep in mind that, while we've made a little bit of progress on responding to shortages in the near term, we're still bouncing around that 300 number, and I don't see anything in the landscape that tells me, so the environment overall has substantially improved, other than just sort of coming out of COVID. You can see where we are experiencing the shortages as far as key drug classes, antimicrobials, chemotherapeutic agents, CNS fluids, and hormone agents. And this is a relatively stable kind of distribution that we've seen over the past several years. Obviously, the fluids most recently were in the news with the Hurricane Helene impacts of the on the Baxter facilities, and that was I think that was, there's some learnings there, and I have some data from how facilities responded to that and what the impact on care was. I do think that when these events occur, these sort of acute events, they are a little bit of a wake-up call to policymakers, and we can talk about that a little bit later on in this conversation. I think there's an awareness from policymakers that there are these shortages. We have seen across administrations, the Obama administration, Trump administration, Biden administration, and I suspect Trump again, have all had some kind of initiatives internally to respond to drug shortages. And Congress throughout those periods has done some work. There was legislation during COVID-19 to respond to drug shortages and provide some additional transparency into the drug supply, basically requiring manufacturers to disclose some information about their manufacturing sites and API sources. Disclose that to the Food and Drug Administration. But as you can probably guess, this is just not an issue that is top of mind for policymakers, especially in Congress. And so as a result, it is very hard to get their attention. There is good work being done. There's actually bipartisan legislation that is being developed with some, I think, potentially effective solutions to respond to drug shortages, but it's not top of mind. And so the result is we probably won't see that legislation move until there is an emergency that really gets people's attention. Some severe shortages that is rises to the top of the kind of public awareness. Unfortunately, it takes that kind of event to get policymakers to elevate this issue in their priorities. I do want to share that. I thought this was an interesting graph just to show you how kind of acute events can impact on-hand supply of products. So this is basically the sort of the line graph overlaying this chart is the baseline inventory that hospitals had on hand of certain IV fluids that were impacted by the Hurricane Helene impact on Baxter's facilities. And you can see in the graph kind of moving to the left how hospitals sort of were dwindling their supply and getting into a week or less of supply over time. You can see how that kind of increased from October to December. So, this is just an illustration of a couple things. Like, number one, this does have a real impact on facilities, and there were plenty of facilities that were canceling procedures, as I'm sure you are all well aware. But it also does show that having some inventory on hand can be a mitigating factor for short-term solutions. And while I have concerns about geographic concentration of manufacturing. I will say that we were actually we from ASHP's perspective, were pretty impressed by how quickly the government worked with Baxter and other manufacturers to free up supply and get access to that facility and get that facility back up running. So there is a little bit of a lesson here of having some supply on hand can be a mitigating factor when these shortages do occur. This gives you a sense of kind of where we see kind of clinical impacts of shortages and where they tend to be felt most severely. So this was from a survey that we did of ASHP members about basically how are these different shortages that are ongoing. You know, if you compared the sort of list of the top classes to, okay, how is this actually impacting your practice? And you can get a sense of where that pain was felt most severely from practicing clinicians. And so you can see that the chemotherapeutic agents, the hormonal agents, and others kind of just where that pain was most severe. And basically this critical impact, moderate impact, we characterize these as basically the extent to which procedures were actually having to be canceled or delayed. I would just mention, you know, when you're looking at this list of products and the impacts, some of these do pop out with policymakers. You know, the impact on antineoplastics, that was, to some extent, those do resonate with members of Congress. I think they, you know, understand that oncology products are you know, important for patient care, and they, you know, they can kind of just at a visceral level, they understand that there's a need and may understand that in many cases there are not good alternative products for some of those. And so those can be a sort of a wake-up call for policymakers. I mentioned, you know, with the oral liquids, anything kind of impacting, you know, anything impacting children tends to get you know, get elevated in the sort of minds of policymakers. Parenteral nutrition has at times kind of elevated in the minds of policymakers. And antimicrobials has actually been a sort of persistent policy conversation, though for slightly different reasons. There are some particular challenges in bringing new antimicrobials to market, and there's been a sort of ongoing conversation around those products. It's maybe worth noting, you know, I'm kind of sharing ASHP's perspective on drug shortages, but one of the core challenges we have in getting policymakers to respond is that there are actually different definitions that get used in the marketplace about what a shortage is. And so when we at ASHP think about drug shortages, we're thinking about at the healthcare provider level. I am trying to treat my patient today. Is there product available for me to treat my patient today? And that could be that could mean, like, does the pharmacy have the ability to dispense the product? Do I need to use different therapies? It could mean you might even be like a particular distributor doesn't have access, but another does. And so the facilities that are served, the hospitals or the pharmacies that are served by a particular distributor can't access a product for whatever reason. Whereas when FDA thinks about drug shortages, they think about it at the manufacturer level. So is there sufficient supply to meet the demand based on whatever information the manufacturer has and anything we can get about sales? It's not too hard to see that there's a little bit of a tension there, right? It's fine if the manufacturer is saying, yeah, I don't have any disruptions on my end. I think I'm meeting the market demand, but you know, if for some reason, whether it's a distributor issue or a localized disruption, if at the end of the day, providers can't access the product and patients can't access the product, there is in a very real sense, a shortage of that product where it is needed. And so that is what ASHP tracks, and that is what we are trying to shed light on. And then so when we talk about resolution, it comes back to those same issues of are all formulations available for those products at the local level that providers can access, whereas FDA's version of a shortage being resolved is one or more manufacturers are in production and able to meet market demands. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's for all formulations. So you might have to might have to dilute product and so forth. I don't want to, when I say these things, I am not here to disparage the Food and Drug Administration. I think that the drug shortage team at the FDA is doing God's work. They really are quite responsive, and as I mentioned in that most recent Baxter response, I thought they were quite effective. And there are tools that they can use when there are shortages, but there is sort of a fundamental disconnect between the way that we as providers see drug shortages and what they are tracking. And I just think that's worth noting because it has some downstream impacts. So you can see, I won't get into the FDA numbers in detail, but compare these to the numbers that I shared with you. We at ASHP see something like 300 active shortages, whereas FDA is tracking something like a little under 100 shortages, and that's because of that difference in definitions. For folks who are not familiar with the FDA lingo, CDER is the office that manages new drugs and generics. CBER is the office that represents biologics and vaccines. So I mentioned that there's a difference. So if you think about ASHP's definition, basically gaps in supply that disrupt patient care at the local level and the provider level versus FDA's that are at the whole market level and the manufacturer level. What does that actually mean? Why does that matter? Is that just a tracking issue? It's not just a tracking issue. Here's what actually happens. And just a reminder that I, was previously at FDA, and ASHP works with FDA all the time to trigger some responses to shortages when we see them. If a drug is not yet recognized by FDA as in shortage, there's some tools that they can't access. So when FDA actually declares a shortage, they can expedite importation of product from overseas. And often this really just means allowing a manufacturer to import their own product. So like any given product or any given manufacturer might have facilities overseas that are serving that market and are not necessarily reviewed by FDA for serving the US domestic market. So they might expedite that. They might find alternate manufacturers also. And it takes time for FDA to say, yes, we are comfortable with the manufacturing processes that are in place at that facility. They can expedite that in the event of a shortage, but it does take time. And if there's no shortage declared because you're one of those 200 products that ASHP sees as a shortage, but FDA does not, you're not going to be able to use those mechanisms. It also creates the opportunity for 503B compounders to compound products from bulk when a product is in shortage. That can be an alleviating mechanism of domestic shortages in the near term. There are mechanisms ASHP FDA can use, like extending expiration dates on products if that is appropriate, and if there's been some amount of review of the clinical appropriateness of that. Of course, there are mechanisms to expedite review of ANDAs. Those are the generic drug applications for new generic drugs. That is obviously a slower process than them importing or compounding new product. And as I mentioned, you can expedite inspection of facilities that would let you bring additional manufacturing capacity online in the near term. Let me just take a second to look through the Q&A. So there was a question about tariffs. How could new tariffs that are in place, with new tariffs that are in place, how could that affect expedited international shipping of drugs? I'm going to talk more about tariffs in a second, but I do think, like, given that one of the solutions here is for drug shortages that FDA can exercise is importation. Yes, absolutely. If there were tariffs imposed on those products, number one, it might raise the price of those products. Number two, it might disincentivize manufacturers from shipping products. Like, as I mentioned, sometimes this is a manufacturer that is just shipping its own product from its facility, maybe serving Europe, to a facility serving the US. If it becomes economically unprofitable to ship that product to the US, that's another reason the manufacturer may be sort of less inclined to do that. We'll talk in more detail about tariffs in a little bit. So let's talk about some of the root causes that we see. So this is based on our work with ASHP and the University of Utah. So the manufacturers will work with the University of Utah and will report, or when we see a manufacturer or a shortage in the marketplace, the University of Utah drug shortages team will reach out to that manufacturer and try to identify the reason for the sort of root cause for that. Now, unfortunately, there's something like half the shortages we don't have good visibility into it, but you can see from the others there are raw material issues. There are a business decision, the orange, which could be basically it's not profitable for me to be making this product anymore. I'm going to switch to a different product that is more profitable. Supply and demand. I mean, that's really sort of just a different version of the economic challenges. But it could also potentially mean a supply disruption or a demand spike. I did acknowledge that can be an issue. The hurricane or kind of other natural disasters, and some kind of manufacturing issue. So FDA has stated that manufacturing quality is responsible for something like half of shortages. We see 17% being reported here. That doesn't mean that there's a quality problem with the drug itself. What it means is there's some issue that something in your manufacturing process was out of spec, and you needed to shut down a line, or there could have been an inspection problem that needs to be resolved. But for whatever reason, if there's a manufacturing disruption that takes you offline, that results in a shortage. And the supply of some of these products, there often are not that many manufacturers in the market for some of the products that tend to go in shortages. There can be a few, but it's not, we're not talking about dozens of manufacturers here that just can pick up the slack if a facility goes down. So what are those shortages that I mentioned? What are the root causes? So requirements related to good manufacturing practices. That's kind of consistent with what I was just describing. If you have a problem with your manufacturing process, or you have an inspection issue that needs to be resolved before you continue manufacturing. Ingredients, active ingredients or key starting materials can be another source of a supply chain disruption. Discontinuation, I would sort of describe that as a manufacturer making a decision to exit the market for a given product, and that absolutely does happen. That can be very disruptive, but it's a legitimate business decision that folks need to make, given that they have constrained manufacturing capacity and they're going to manufacture the products that are profitable for them. Manufacturing delays. This could come in a couple different forms. It could mean a manufacturer wants to bring an additional manufacturing facility online, but has to wait for that facility to be inspected. Potentially, it could be a generic drug review process. In general, I don't see that as a root cause of shortages, but it can be a cause for delay in responding to a shortage. Shortage of Inactive ingredients can also be an issue, of course, just a shipping or kind of distribution disruption. And then finally, we mentioned increases in demand. So FDA published its own analysis of some of those root causes of shortages, and it found, basically similar things as what ASHP sees here. Lack of incentives to produce less profitable drugs. We already mentioned that, and we mentioned that in some cases, sterile injectables can be even more acute for the sterile injectables, generic sterile injectables. There's not a lot of recognition in the market for having good quality management systems. And what I mean by that is, if you are a manufacturer and you invest heavily in quality, you've got multiple redundancies, you've got additional manufacturing capacity, you've got additional finished product stored off site that is that can meet an increase in demand or a natural disaster at one of your sites. Great, you did all that. You don't get any extra, any money. You're not going to get any more extra money in the market. No one's going to pay you a premium for that. That's part of the problem. Is there's not a lot of incentive for purchasers to pay a premium for some of those quality investments right now. There are a few examples of purchasers kind of recognizing that and trying to do some additional investment. You see that in some of these pre-purchase kind of these longer-term contract agreements where a purchaser might actually be willing to pay some premium to guarantee some stability and guarantee of supply. But often this is challenging because those investments in quality are largely invisible to the purchaser, right? You as a purchaser have no idea if a manufacturer, that they're complying with FDA, and that is the baseline for being on the market, and that is a high baseline, right? I don't want to take anything away from that. I certainly don't want to question the quality of products that are on the market, but having quality, as we refer to it sometimes, as in the manufacturing process that will give us some guarantee that the supply is stable, that is a lot harder for a purchaser to see. And so even if they want to pay a premium for that, it's kind of hard for them to know if they're actually getting that kind of a robust supply chain, if they're accessing a supplier with a robust supply chain. And then logistical and regulatory challenges with market recovery after a disruption. So this is some of the things that we were talking about. Some of those can be regulatory delays when you're trying to bring an additional facility online or trying to import product from abroad in order to respond to a shortage. There was a question about what percentage of pharmaceutical manufacturers are operating overseas, and by what mechanism are those sites inspected? Oh, I see someone's answering. I'm going to see how they answer that, and then I'll respond. Okay, so there's a few different kind of economic issues here. So we talked about you can have situations where a manufacturer just said, look, it's no longer profitable for me to be in the market for this product. Or I'm going to sort of dedicate my manufacturing capacity to a different product that is more lucrative. And those are legitimate business decisions that manufacturers can make, but they do have impacts on shortages. You can also have situations where there's an intersection of the kind of quality issue and the economics, right? If there's an issue where manufacturer's been making a product that is not terribly profitable, and then they have a supply disruption, that might be a time for them to make a business decision to say, you know what, we're not going to invest in trying to resolve this problem. We're going to now take this opportunity to say, we're going to switch gears and produce a different product. Again, a legitimate business decision that they can make, but it does have downstream impacts on supply of product. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. These are just kind of different examples of companies leaving the market for some of those economic reasons, companies exiting the market or having a disruption for inspectional failures that represent kind of market manufacturing quality problems. So let me just pause here and say, which of the following tend to be reported causes of drug shortages? Manufacturing issues, shortages of an active ingredient, increases in demand, and regulatory delays. Oh, you guys are very responsive. This is great. I see you. I'm just going to give you 5 more seconds. All right, we're going to share the results here. Looks like time to share the results. Looks like almost 90% of you said all of the above, and that is the right answer, all of the above. Let me ask you another question now. True or false? Most of the drug shortages reported to ASHP did not have a reported cause. True or false? Yeah, I'm going to cut this one short. Yes, you guys, you are right. The bulk of you said true, and it is true. There's a if we go back to here, unfortunately, we don't have a ton of visibility into a good chunk of why these manufacturing or these supply disruptions happen for a good chunk of shortages. And that part of that goes to this just issue of transparency in the supply chain. As a purchaser, you know, we're representing pharmacists that are on that purchasing side of the supply chain and the clinician side, and we just don't see unless someone is willing to tell us, was the issue that I couldn't access API? Was that I couldn't ship the product? Was it that you know, sometimes you think you have sort of redundancy in your system, like you're relying on a contract manufacturer, but if multiple different suppliers are using the same contract manufacturer, the same source of API, they might both be experiencing disruption in their supply chain. And you might think you had redundancy in your system that you could turn to, but you might actually not. So all these kind of things happen. And this is an issue where ASHP thinks that a greater transparency in the supply chain would be valuable for us to understand when we really do have redundancy in our supply chain, and when is it sort of you know, illusory. You know, if you're relying on 2 different manufacturers but they're using the same API source, it might not buy you the redundancy you think you have. Okay, so what are some of the different instances where you see this? What tends to be correlated with shortages? I mentioned manufacturing complexity. I mentioned that in the context of sterile injectables. So that is one factor that tends to show up when we see shortages. Low prices is the other. You don't tend to see shortages of branded products. And that is because you know, a branded product, the manufacturer is effectively a monopoly. They can charge the prices that they want and that the market will bear. And so there's a substantial profit incentive to meet any demand that's in the market if it is at the price that you're willing to charge or that you're charging. Whereas if you are in the generic space, if there's multiple generic manufacturers and you are competing primarily on price, because as I mentioned, we don't really see that much competition on kind of supply chain strength, that drives down price. And so it can become, you're basically, the price that you are charging approaches your cost of production, or can even be below it in some instances, below the total cost of production. And that's basically an invitation to exit the market if you have any kind of disruption or need additional investment to stay in the market. Market concentration or geographic concentration. So think about the Hurricane Helene example that we talked about. You know, the Baxter facility, it's great that we have domestic manufacturing of those products. But it is a concentrated site, and if there's a disruption at that site due to a natural disaster, then you've got a significant gap in the market. And then quality, to the extent that if you see a manufacturer with a bunch of FDA inspectional challenges, a bunch of warning letters, then that is a manufacturer that is more likely to experience a shortage because either of a direct FDA action or because they drop out of the market, or because inspection reports are somewhat visible, although all the details are not. So to some extent, purchasers can see that and could choose not to source from that product or that manufacturer. There was the question in the chat. I thought someone was responding to it, but it looks like not. What percentage of pharmaceutical manufacturers are operating overseas, and what mechanism are those sites inspected? So let me share. We're going to get to a slide that shows where the manufacturers are. But as far as what's the mechanism that they are inspected, FDA does inspect those sites. It is harder for them to do overseas inspections. It can be challenging to get the staffing for those, but there are those sites are still inspected by FDA. In some cases, there will be some level of kind of risk assessment based on how robust that country's domestic regulator is, right? If you have a strong regulator and you have some confidence that that company is being inspected, that might slightly reduce your FDA's perceived risk of that plant, but FDA is actually physically going and inspecting those plants. That's also why it can be challenging, right? If you need to get a plant that's overseas inspected quickly, getting FDA inspectors there does take some time. Assessing geographic risk, the federal government has put out some reports on this, and basically the DoD does try to source product domestically, and will actually explore kind of finding additional domestic manufacturers. Will try to come up with solutions for compounding and other solutions to meet their needs. So when you look at where are the sources of some of these products, you can see that there are some products that are more concentrated in different areas than others. EU drives a lot of this. There are some products categories like antibiotics where China is the primary source of products. I would just say this is finished product. Okay, so I want folks to understand that when you're looking at API or key starting ingredients, it is a slightly different landscape, and especially with regard to key starting materials, China tends to have more of those. In the generic space, India tends to have more of the manufacturing of certain products. So it does vary by product category, but this just gives you a sense. Geopolitical risk is often cited as a threat to the drug supply, and ASHP and several manufacturers and the federal government have actually participated in some roundtables discussing those geopolitical risks. And I think it is totally legitimate to say we need more domestic manufacturing of some of these products. ASHP's message tends to be, but that should not come at the expense of reliable foreign manufacturers, because as I mentioned before, concentration is also a risk and a contributing factor in drug shortages. So if you can have domestic manufacturers and also access friendly foreign suppliers from reliable exporting countries, like that is helpful to the stability of the supply chain. We already talked about market concentration, geographic concentration. So one of the words that you'll hear, the two of the words you hear onshoring, so manufacturing these products domestically, and then friendshoring, so having basically those reliable manufacturing partners in countries that are friendly, not geopolitical adversaries. And this could apply to finished dosage form. It could apply to key starting ingredients. It could apply to APIs. Any one of those kind of steps in the manufacturing process is a vulnerability. So if you were thinking about this from a national security perspective, those are all risks, and there are lots of different efforts by the federal government, by DoD, by private industry to try to map out those different sources of key ingredients and APIs and finished dosage forms to figure out, okay, when you put that whole constellation together, where are the vulnerabilities? And you got to do that product by product, API by API. It is not a simple undertaking to just say, we need more domestic manufacturing. So what are the benefits of this? Obviously, inspections are easier. This kind of goes to the question from the audience about overseas inspections. Yes, absolutely. It is easier to get inspectors to domestic manufacturing sites where you probably have inspectors living locally or semi-locally already. You have a little more control over the supply chain. So that can also mean that no one's going to impose an export control on you. So, we did see this during COVID, that India imposed export controls, which basically said, we're going to hold all this supply for our domestic market. We're not going to export any of it. And so all of a sudden, that creates a real vulnerability for your trading partners who have come to rely on you as a source of supply. So obviously, you're not going to see that vulnerability from someone imposing export controls if you're manufacturing something domestically. Jobs and economic growth, that's often a talking point in policy circles. Obviously, it's important for political reasons and very real domestic economic reasons, but it's not something that ASHP is primarily focused on. And then risks. There can be increased cost in production domestically. It's not an accident. It's not by accident that manufacturers tend to locate overseas, right? Sometimes those facilities are subsidized by the local governments to get them operating. Sometimes it's the manufacturing, the energy costs, the labor costs, all those different things can be cheaper, or just you have a supply chain that's ready-made in a different country for whatever reason, and that just means it's easier to produce the product locally. Those are all, totally rational motivators for a manufacturer to source a product or manufacture overseas. And so you got to get a sense of where you see these kind of products being made. And when this slide says acceptable final outcomes, basically this is saying like this is where do you see the kind of good FDA inspection results, and you see that primarily in EU, rest of world, and United States, and to a lesser extent in India and China. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit just for the sake of time. Where we see some responses to these shortages. So obviously identifying therapeutic alternatives, that is a substantial role of pharmacists kind of working in health systems. And it is, I think it is important, but it also tends to, some of these responses that I'm going to describe, they tend to mask the impact of shortage. And this is another reason why policymakers don't actually feel the pain of shortages, because, the clinicians and pharmacists are so good at identifying alternatives and managing around all these shortages. To some extent, rationing occurs, using different dosage forms, and so forth, delaying therapy. That obviously is one that catches policymaker attention. If those are the clinical kind of options, then on the operational side, using different concentrations and vial sizes to prepare product, using 503B purchases as a source of product if there is a declared shortage. so forth. This chart is really just indicating, look, when there are shortages, or just to manage shortages in general, there is a substantial cost that is bared by the health system in the form of higher purchasing costs, as well as higher labor costs to manage those shortages. And that's something that our members have consistently pointed out. We do see some willingness to spend a little more to get some reliability, but as I mentioned, there aren't a lot of there isn't a lot of transparency to know that I'm paying a premium and I'm actually getting some quality benefit or some reliability benefit. There are certainly a few kind of long-term purchasing options in the market. And I think we're going to see more of that. I think we'll also see policymakers trying to encourage that kind of long-term purchasing. But we got to recognize that it does come at some premium. ASHP, for folks who are not familiar, ASHP does have regular kind of updates on solutions for managing drug shortages. And you could just see with regard to IV fluid shortages, we put some recommendations out for conservation of product. So what are the policy solutions? I'm going to just kind of jump to some recommendations that we have put out and where I see policymakers talking about solutions. So in the short term, enforce existing shortage prevention requirements. So there are already transparency requirements that have been passed by Congress. FDA reported, it's going back a year ago or so, but that something like half of facilities aren't actually reporting the required information about where they are, where products being sourced from, where API is being sourced from. Improve transparency into manufacturing quality. As a purchaser, I generally don't have a lot of visibility into how FDA inspectional challenges were resolved. There are good chunks of the inspections reports that are not visible to downstream folks in the supply chain. So anything to kind of encourage manufacturing transparency in that process. Now, I will say, I don't think this has to mean turning over confidential information. If there is some way to bubble that up and for a way to FDA to say, we have a greater level of confidence in this manufacturer's ability to stay online and continue producing and meeting demand for this product, that would be helpful. Even if I don't see all of the details of that, right? I don't think in general, most purchasers want to be getting those details, but they want to have a way to assess confidence in the reliability of their suppliers. And of course, encouraging new manufacturers and new manufacturing sites. And that includes domestic manufacturing. There are lots of different ways to do that. It could be kind of expediting approval of products from new manufacturers. It can be tax incentive for new domestic manufacturing facilities. Like there are lots of policy solutions that policymakers could deploy if they wanted to really do that. And then long-term, I think encouraging long-term guaranteed volume contracts so that the manufacturer has confidence that if they are manufacturing and investing in manufacturing capacity, that they are not going to get then later undercut on price and kind of lose the benefit of that investment. And in turn, the purchaser would have some confidence that, this manufacturer is going to be able to continue to meet my demand. They're going to meet some threshold about supply chain quality or transparency that they're going to share with me in exchange for that, some level of premium, and that they're going to have some inventory on hand that is going to come my way if there is a supply disruption. Diversifying the manufacturing base is another area that could be deployed, especially by the federal government as its role as a purchaser. It could say, rather than just purchasing from one manufacturer, it could say, I'm going to try to have 2 suppliers or 3 suppliers of this product so that I know that there are multiple manufacturers in the marketplace, so that if one exits the market, there's at least someone with an approved product in the market who can start to meet that demand. It doesn't mean it'll happen quickly. It takes a while to get additional manufacturing capacity online, but at least there would be someone in the market already producing that product with an incentive to scale up. The last proposal that we recommend is financing private sector buffer supplies. You remember that graph I showed that kind of the erosion of supply month to month of IV fluids following Hurricane Helene. We think there's an opportunity for the federal government to say, let's provide additional dollars for the purchase and kind of maintenance of additional private sector inventory of products. It doesn't actually have to be inventory held by the pharmacy or the hospital system. This could be inventory that is held by distributors, but is somehow allocated for hospitals. And if we could get some federal dollars in the system to support that, that might go a long way in responding to shortages. It wouldn't address the root cause, but we know that having additional buffer supply in the system is an important mitigating factor. So for things like Baxter, that would actually buy you some of the time to get manufacturing sites back online. So we see some proposals related to this. On the right-hand side of the page there, you'll see this note about Wyden and Crapo. Those are the Republican and Democratic leaders of the Senate Finance Committee, and they are working in a bipartisan manner to propose legislation that would do some of these things. It would include incentivizing long-term purchases of long-term contracts for purchases of product. It would incentivize sharing of some level of transparency information, encourage developing private sector buffer supplies that are financed by the federal government. And so I think there's a lot of potential there for that kind of legislation to help respond to drug shortages in the long term. Now, as I mentioned, I think that's only going to happen if policymakers really feel acute pain and say, we gotta have a solution to this, and then they can turn to something like this bipartisan legislation and hopefully advance it. If that doesn't happen, I honestly can't tell you when the policymakers will pass this legislation, even though it's already in the works. I think that's just kind of the reality of getting Congress's attention to focus on a kind of issue that is important to us, but is sort of a niche issue on Capitol Hill. Okay, let's talk about tariffs for just the last few minutes here. It is absolutely true that diversifying the supply chain and having domestic supply of manufacturing can be an important piece of strengthening our supply chain. And I talked about kind of friendshoring and domestic manufacturing as a way to respond to that, particularly when you have concentration of some products, APIs, key starting materials, and finished dosage forms in countries that are geopolitical adversaries. But I want to just make sure that folks realize a tariff, while it may in the long term incentivize some domestic manufacturing, it is not a near-term solution, right? It will increase the price of those products in the near term. It can actually induce shortages in a couple different situations. Number one, if that price increase makes the manufacturer say, you know what, it's not going to be, well, you increase the price of my API by imposing a tariff, it's no longer profitable for me to manufacture this product. So I'm going to exit the market, right? Or there are some policy mechanisms that say if you increase the price faster than inflation, you have to pay a penalty to the government. Well, now I'm underwater on manufacturing this product, right? I'm actually losing money on the product. And then, of course, the last version can be export control. So I mentioned India having done that in the past. If China said, you're imposing tariffs on us, well, how about this? Instead of paying that tariff, we're just going to stop exporting that product to you. And then all of a sudden you got a real problem of a shortage. And in some products, there's not a lot of alternate supply. So which of this following is a viable solution for policy solution for drug shortages? Improving transparency and incentivizing long-term contracting, or providing financial support for buffer inventory? All right, hopefully you got the answer here, as all of the above may be legitimate solutions. I'm going to post the code there. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this conversation. I'm happy to respond to any questions, and feel free to reach out to me and ASHP for any issues related to drug shortages in the future.